This is Leah Patrick, and are you going to Liberty Forum? You should.
Hi, this is Taryn Lupo. Welcome to LCL Report. I'm going to talk to you today about Martin Luther King. And for me and younger generations, most people only think Martin Luther King, they know the I Had a Dream speech, and they know he did something for civil rights. They really don't know the courage and craziness that was the 60s. I'm going to take you back a little bit to stuff you probably never learned in school about MLK, and just the bravery and just awesome civil disobedience that went down back then. What happened, I'm going to pick it up the first act of civil disobedience that was a big milestone. So, again, a lot of this went down in Birmingham and down in the South, and everything was segregated. Whites and blacks had different things, and one of those was in restaurants. You couldn't go to a counter and sit at an all-white counter if you were black. Some protesters, some very, very brave protesters, decided to non-violently challenge that and be a civil disobedient and sit at this counter. This basically enraged the white population there, and you'll actually see this footage of them dragging him off the counter and beating this poor guy. And instead of the police getting mad and arresting the people that beat up this poor black activist, they instead arrest the activist. Yeah, that's nice, isn't it? Well, this encouraged other activism. This got all over, since there was footage of this, it was all over the news. And Martin Luther King decided, and tried to encourage racial unity, and there were these things that popped up called Liberty Riders. And the Liberty Riders were a group of buses that would go around with black and white supporters and try to show racial harmony. These, in return, were very controversial at the time. People resisted whenever these buses would come through and try to stop the buses, and then eventually it turned to violence where they would attack the buses with fire bombs and blow the buses up. Now, we look at today, and yeah, there's some crazy activism out there, and people definitely get their heads beat in, by batons, but fire bombs, that's a whole different level. So this, again, was taped, and people saw this, and it disgusted the country. And the next big step, which I really want to focus on today, was the Children's March in Birmingham in May 1963. Basically, what would happen in the South is if a black person decided to show up to a rally, they'd lose their job. And most of them work for white people. So they were very fearful, and they couldn't protest anything. And the children kind of knew about this. And the political strategy was to get the children to protest. It was very controversial, to have children protest was left a bad taste in for some people's mouth. But we got to back this up to why they did this. Martin Luther King was at a demonstration and a protest, and finally decided himself he was going to get arrested. And he gets tossed into jail. It was probably some of his best writing, really. He wrote the very famous letters about being in solitary, the letters from Birmingham jail. But when he got out, it was barely a blip on the news, and he felt kind of discouraged about that. So he called his activist friend, who was he was a DJ, actually, of all people. And this guy, who was a DJ, decided to come up with the idea to fill the jails so they couldn't be ignored. Just completely overwhelm the system by just putting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the jail cells of Birmingham. So they organized this secretly in the churches, mainly are the way this word gets out. And then the DJ gives a special code on the radio saying that, okay, this day in May, we're going to do this. And at first, the announcement goes out, everybody knows the day's going to happen, and the kids are kind of scared. And some of them have the courage and step out and actually just leave class. The teachers, the black teachers also know about this, so they turn their backs and the kids all run out of class like the teacher had no control over it, right? And they're climbing out the windows and they're going, and they finally get to a church. So all the kids start gathering in this church, and the cops know about it. They're sitting outside the church and they're ready. And they don't realize how many kids are in this church. And they start sending these waves of kids out, 50 at a time, and they're just peacefully getting arrested. They're walking up. They were getting arrested for protesting without a permit, right? They get arrested, and they're just jamming these paddy wagons full of kids, and it's all nonviolent. And the cops are kind of puzzled because none of these kids are scared. They're laughing, they're having a good time, and they're enjoying getting arrested. And then the church would send out another 50, and another 50, and another 50. And the cops were trying to figure out how all these people were fitting in the church, and they were loading. People were coming in and sneaking in the back of the church, and they were just sending waves out. So it just never stopped. By the end of the day, they had almost 1,000 kids arrested. Now, these were young kids, and they all lied about, every time they were asked, all of them said they were under 15, so they wouldn't, for some reason, then they don't send you to the adult prisons. So they just flooded it, and the cops had a complete breakdown, didn't know what to do with it. Then the next day, the word got out, and a lot of these same criminals were released, and they, again, marched in front of the cops. But the second day, there was a lot more protesters, and the cops upped the game. They brought out the water hoses and started just knocking people off their feet and blowing them down the street. Then they started letting dogs out, and this caused a lot of people to, it's one thing to be a civil disobedient and say, yeah, I'm going to march. It's a whole other thing to keep your calm when you're getting shot at and dogs are biting you. So there were some violence problems. I think some of the protesters threw bricks back at them when they opened up on them. But they still kept it pretty much nonviolent. At the end of the day, it was 2,000 people that got arrested, pretty much. And then that was all over the news, that the cops opened up and blasted little, 10-year-old kids down the street with fire hoses and set dogs on them. And so what eventually happened was day after day, hundreds more would arrive. And it was so overwhelming and stepping up the odds that there was a complete breakdown. The cops couldn't control it anymore, and they basically were having really problems. They couldn't arrest anyone at this point because it was so overwhelming. They were bringing up school buses and just loading them full of kids, and they stopped putting them in the jail. They put them in where they house animals at the county fair, and it was really, really bad in that sense. But the kids made a game of it. They got used to the water hoses, started showing up in bathing suits, and were dancing and while getting sprayed, and they just lost all authority in the eyes of the nation because every night this is all over the news. It's being broadcast, and it really put a bad taste in people's mouth. I think this is an extremely important lesson for civil disobedience, is get it on tape, and the public outrage, people get disgusted and things change. I mean, they had been trying to fight these Jim Crow laws for 100 years and nothing happened. It finally took a group of brave children to stand up and break that. And when it happened quickly because of mass civil disobedience. It's amazing what type of results that can get when you get enough people on board and it's nonviolent. The state has no idea what to do with nonviolence. They know how to handle violent people. They will beat you down and then say, look how violent he was. He attacked the cops. Of course we had to put this violent criminal down. It's a whole different story when they're blasting 10-year-old kids, and sicking dogs on them. That's just disgusting to most people. They don't have a stomach for that over something like race. So finally what happens is it does influence Kennedy to make a civil rights bill and get it all over. I mean, within a week, this is already on TV and Kennedy's already talking about it. It just goes to show for today's movement how powerful it is if you can get everybody on the same page. And MLK surprisingly started this, but lost kind of control of the activists during it. He was like, it's pretty much out of my hands, support these children because they're trying to, they're fighting for mankind. And eventually he's the one that sat down and negotiated terms about segregation in Alabama. It just shows how fast things can change if you're willing to take some risk, put it on the line. So that is a brief history of MLK Day and why I'm a big